Hi, Jamie Cowen here to talk with you today about the beginning of the end of the religious right. As I've shared in previous videos, the so-called religious right began in 1979 with the formation of the moral majority. Jerry Falwell, the founder of the moral majority, toured the United States in the mid-1970s calling America to return to her Christian roots. Falwell, in conjunction with conservative political operatives, formed an organization that ultimately served as the basis for raising a large religious political movement that has affected elections and the culture of the United States. Since the moral majority, numerous other evangelical political organizations arose, almost all of which are associated with the Republican Party. These organizations constitute what is known as the religious right, which is probably the largest constituency of the Republican Party. Today, most improbably, the religious right has found its greatest advocate in the White House in the person of Donald Trump. For a variety of reasons, the religious right's influence in American politics is about to precipitously decline, leaving in its wake an American public increasingly turned off to the gospel, and a Republican Party that must broaden its appeal beyond this narrow interest group if it wants to survive. In earlier years, evangelicalism was active in political reforms, among other things, advocating for prison reform, enactment of child labor laws, and the abolitionist movement. However, as slavery became more entrenched in Southern life, Southern evangelicals began rejecting the idea that their faith should lead to social reforms, fearful that such reforms could lead to the abolition of slavery. Rather, they adopted a doctrine called the spirituality of the church. This doctrine argued that the church and the world around it were separate, and those who were Christians were to avoid the surrounding world, including attempting to reform it. When there was involvement with the world, it was often reactionary, such as reacting to changing social mores in society, similar to the modern religious right movement. An example where social reform ultimately ran amok and became a disastrous political movement was the response to the problem of alcoholism, later known as prohibition. Now, I believe there's some lessons here for us today. The Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century, where multiple thousands became Christians, led to a push for social reform, including combating alcoholism. This social response was known as the Temperance Movement. Following the Civil War, the Temperance Movement picked up steam. Southern evangelicals fully supported the effort as a distraction from addressing racial equality. The big push to bar the sale of alcohol found its ultimate success with the formation of the Anti-Saloon League in 1893. Under the leadership of Wayne Wheeler, the Anti-Saloon League stressed political results and perfected the art of pressure politics. The League successfully elected pro-prohibition candidates to office, and it mobilized voters to pass state laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol. Sound familiar? The League's motto was, "The Church in Action Against the Saloon." Most Protestant denominations and the Catholic Church supported the League. Finally, in December 1917, both houses of Congress passed a constitutional amendment barring the manufacturing and sale of alcohol. Even more remarkably, within 1 year, this 18th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified by a sufficient number of states to make it the law. Almost immediately, prohibition caused large problems. The wealthy had stockpiled huge caches of alcoholic beverages, whereas the poor were stuck. Bootlegging became widespread. Crime syndicates took over alcohol distribution, somewhat comparable to today's drug cartels. Shortly after its ratification, there was pressure from numerous groups to repeal the amendment, finally doing so in 1933, only 13 years after its ratification. The 18th Amendment, prohibiting the manufacture and sale of alcohol, is the only constitutional amendment ever repealed. At the time, alcoholism was seen as the cause of most personal and social problems. Prohibition was seen as the solution to poverty, crime, and violence. Upon the ratification of the 18th Amendment, Billy Sunday, the most famous evangelist of his time, said, quote, "The slums will soon only be a memory. We will turn our prisons into factories and our jails into storehouses and corn cribs," unquote. Yet in the end, it was an abject failure. Now, why am I talking about prohibition? Because there are numerous similarities between the prohibition movement and the religious right's political positions and efforts to curb changes in American culture. It's true, alcoholism was and still is a serious social and moral problem. But enacting laws to change a popular cultural phenomenon back then backfired. The original temperance movement's warnings of the dangers of alcohol, leading many to curb excess drinking or to stop drinking altogether, was and is extremely beneficial. In fact, many who come to faith in Jesus do so. But addressing a personal, moral, and spiritual issue through legislation didn't work then, and it should be a lesson for today. Following the failures of prohibition and the simultaneous failure to publicly battle against the teaching of evolution highlighted in the Scopes monkey trial, the evangelical movement largely divorced itself from political action until the rise of the moral majority. Now, what's different about the religious right's political agenda and operations from earlier evangelical efforts is the religious right is trying to revert the country to an earlier era, whereas earlier evangelical political action was to advance the cause of remedying social and legal inequities in the country. In other words, the goal was to advance the causes of the disenfranchised or marginalized, the things that Yeshua highlighted in the Sermon on the Mount. The religious right is dominated by older white evangelicals who imagine an earlier and better era, which for this group probably was. The terrible irony of this movement is its unqualified support for a president whose character and qualities are the exact opposite of what these groups represent. While many in these groups admit the president's personal shortcomings, almost all support his re-election as the last stand of their worldview. Realistically, it will be the last stand for the religious right. Trump is almost certain to lose the election and lose it big. His main voters will be the religious right, but they will become a distinct minority. In their wake is a younger generation appalled at the hypocrisy and intolerance of these groups. The religious right has no future comparable to what happened to prohibition. America is in need of a revival, but a revival in the church of those who follow the real Jesus, the one who laid down his life for the people, who when insulted did not insult back, who said, "My kingdom is not of this world." America needs those who seek to apply the principles of God's kingdom, justice, mercy, and peace to the world around them. This is a world we should long for and serve. Jesus said the kingdom of God is at hand. Let's work together for the advancement of that kingdom. Thank you, and see you next time.